Hey, welcome along, gang, and welcome back to another edition of the Rolling Stone number 101. Hope that you all had a great weekend, and more importantly, even than that, hope that all the fathers out there had a terrific Father's Day with your kids and with your entire family. I had a really good day with my dad. In fact, that is why, as a matter of fact, for the second week in a row, the Rolling Stone is actually being published here on YouTube on Monday instead of on the actual weekend, because I was actually with my dad and the rest of my family for the day. And I think that as the world descends more and more into madness, which is the only really accurate way to describe it, ideological madness, those times when we can actually get with our families and celebrate the common goodness of life, I think is going to become more and more important. So hope that on that front you all had a wonderful weekend and a wonderful Father's Day. Now, on to the meat and potatoes of this edition of The Stone. Cast your minds back, gang, last year to last August, when the entire country was rioting. And remember specifically St. Louis. And if you think about St. Louis last year in August, when riots were occurring, you will more than likely remember a couple who became famous because they pointed firearms at a group of quote-unquote protesters. The husband had a rifle and the wife had a pistol. Well, their names, in case you'd forgotten them, because of course it's been almost a year ago, and a couple of things have happened since then, their names were Mark and Patricia McCloskeys, and they're both lawyers in the St. Louis area. Well, news has come by this past week that the McCloskeys have both pled guilty to misdemeanor charges, I should say. This comes from the UK Independent via Yahoo News. As part of their plea, the couple, who are both lawyers, agreed to give up the weapons they had on them during the high-profile incident. Mrs. McCloskeys, who had carried a semi-automatic pistol, pleaded guilty to misdemeanor harassment and was fined $2,000, while her husband, who had been armed with an AR-15 style rifle, pleaded guilty to misdemeanor fourth-degree assault and was fined $750. During the hearing on Thursday, Judge David Mason asked Mr. McCloskeys if he acknowledged that his actions put people at risk of personal injury. "I sure did, Your Honor," he replied. The couple can continue to own guns and will not lose their law licenses, as the charges were only misdemeanors. Not only that, but apparently Mr. McCloskeys, Mark McCloskeys, is now running for the Republican candidate for Missouri's U.S. Senate seat, and was unapologetic when he spoke after the hearing. "I do it again," he said, outside the St. Louis courthouse. "Anytime the mob approaches me, I'll do what I can to put them in imminent threat of physical injury, because that's what kept them from destroying my house and my family." Okay, so there you have it. The McCloskeys basically took a plea deal, probably so that they could get out of the grind of the metallic teeth that is the U.S. judicial system, and they pled guilty to these misdemeanor charges, and then they agreed to give up the firearms that they actually used during the incident. Again, well, not again because I'm mentioning it for the first time, but to emphasize, no one was killed, wounded, hurt, or anything else during this incident. I mean, you've got a couple of snowflakes out there who say that, "Oh my gosh, I was absolutely terrified that I was going to be murdered, and I haven't slept a wink since this incident happened." But do these people really have cause to be terrified that they were going to be murdered? Because technically these people were trespassing. This mob was rioting, gang. I want to read real quickly from BBC News, the British Broadcasting Company News, because they had a story about the McCloskeys last year right after the incident occurred. This story was published August 25th of 2020. And it makes it quite clear that these protesters, these rioters, were trespassing. Yes, the video footage shows that they never actually stepped onto the McCloskeys' yard, but the McCloskeys, actually, they live in a private neighborhood. They live in a private neighborhood, okay? Because actually, these protesters, they were going to protest right outside the mayor's home, because the mayor actually lives in this sequestered neighborhood. It's a gated community, is what it is. And they were going to protest the mayor. Let's see here. On this particular evening, protesters were upset about a specific incident 2 days earlier. During Mayor Crewson's regular scheduled COVID-19 live stream briefing, the mayor read aloud from letters from protesters who were urging her to defund the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. She also read the full names and, in some cases, addresses of the letter writers. Some people took this as an attempt to dox the protesters publicly, sharing identifying information, and accused Crewson of intimidation tactics. The following day, she apologized and removed the Facebook Live event. Nevertheless, the call went out across the city for demonstrators to converge on Crewson's doorsteps in the Central West and demanding her resignation. So, in protest of putting these people, quote unquote, at risk, they were actually going to intimidate the mayor herself at her private home, not at City Hall or anything like that. And by the way, this is a tried and true tactic that the left has done from Antifa and BLM. They dox people all the time. So I think that it is perfectly acceptable for public officials to say this person believes that the police should be defunded. This person believes that the police should be defunded. This person believes that the police should be defunded, because then you can actually name names. Because here's the thing, if you honestly believe that defunding the police, abolishing the police is actually necessary for justice, whether it's social justice, whether it's racial justice, whatever, if you honestly believe that that's true, and if you want to lead a revolutionary moment, which is what it is, because every civilization has had policing powers of some kind, gang, and saying that the state or local government shouldn't have policing powers at all is a pipe dream that's cooked up in a utopia. When you actually pledge yourself to a revolutionary action like that, a revolutionary course, let us say, then you definitely, if you honest to God believe that, then you should make your names public. You should have the guts and the balls to actually stand up and say, yes, by gum, this is where I stand. Okay, so they went into this gated community. Now, the footage shows the gate twisted and broken, but there's actually no footage of these protesters actually tearing down the gates. They claim that it was just unlocked, it was open, so they walked in. But then, the incident with the McCloskeys began. Mr. McCloskey says, quote, as soon as I said the words private property, it seemed to enrage them as the mob was walking by his home. I ran in, got my rifle. I started standing on the wing of the patio saying, private property, get out of here. They kept pouring in. That seemed to make them want to come forward. And the protesters then started to say, well, we're on a public street. We're on a public street, so therefore we're not trespassing on private property. You're just trying to intimidate us. However, most legal analysts, again, according to the BBC story here, agree that the protesters were trespassing when they entered Portland Place, the gated community, because it's also true that the streets are in Portland Place, in that gated community, are not public. They are not public. It's private property owned by a trust. Residents pay towards its management, the upkeep of the street, as well as private security. Also, it seems as if some of the protesters, rioters, were actually starting to threaten the McCloskeys, with several of them saying, we will revisit you. Which, again, take it in the context of everything else that had been happening in the country since the end of May 2020, could be taken as a threat of intimidation. It could have been taken as a threat, So anyway, the long and the short of it is that even if you think that the McCloskeys overreacted, they were well within their rights to make a display of force on both their private property, the property that they own within the gated community, as well as defending the gated community itself, which they have a stake in as residents who pay towards its maintenance, its roads, as well as the private security force that keeps everyone safe at night. Okay, so what does that mean? What does that mean in the context of this news story? That they pled guilty to these misdemeanor charges and their firearms, the firearms that they used to confront this riot, let us just say, had to be taken away. What does that say? The long and the short of it, gang, is that the energy has been handed to mob violence. Because now, when you trespass on property, whether it's personal property or whether it's a gated community, and when people within that gated community, people who actually own private property within that community now try to defend it, try to defend themselves and just say, hey, get out. Because again, no one knew what was going to happen. Yeah, these people were protesting peacefully. We had also had examples earlier of protests that started out peacefully and then all of a sudden there's looting, there's rioting, there's fires breaking out right and left. So nobody knew what was going to happen. You have a bunch of people who don't belong in this gated community because they don't live there, so therefore they have no business being there, walking through bold as brass, heading towards the mayor's house. And you don't know what's going to happen. Your house might be caught in the crossfire. Someone might just take it into their head that, hey, let's just set this house on fire. Let's break some of its windows. So, when you're in that situation, you have a bunch of people trespassing, because that's technically what was happening, and you don't know what exactly is going to happen, but you know what has been happening in other parts of the country. You have an absolute right to defend yourself, defend your family, defend your property. But when you take those natural, commonsensical, and I would even argue legal steps to protect yourself, your family, and your property, then you are treated as the criminal, when you are slapped with the fines, when charges are brought against you, when you have to give up your weapons, the message that is being sent out, clear as crystal, to every single blessed corner of this formerly great nation, is that the trespassers are the good people and the defenders of their own property are the villains. That is the message that's being sent. It sends all the energy to the protesters, to the rioters. And it says you can break the law. Absolutely, you can break the law. You will suffer no harmful consequences. Just like the people who burned down Minneapolis. They were getting bailed out by staffers of the Biden campaign, by Hollywood bigwigs like Seth Rogen, because it wasn't their homes that were being destroyed. It wasn't their neighborhoods that were being set on fire. Oh, good gracious, no. Absolutely not. So of course they should be let out onto the streets again, so that they could continue burning, pillaging, looting, and robbing, and terrorizing the common, normal, average citizen. So the question really becomes, and here's the basic point, because the question then really becomes, well, then what could the McCloskeys do, Nate? Okay, what could the McCloskeys do? Because I fully admit that whatever the McCloskeys did here in this situation was going to backfire on them, simply because we now live in a society where if you belong to a certain group, no matter what you do or what you say, you are automatically wrong. It is proof of your racism. It is proof of your privilege. It is proof of your oppression, really, how you are oppressing others. So what could they do? And the unfortunate answer here, gang, is that they couldn't do a single blessed thing. They couldn't do a damn thing about it. And that is the horrible situation that we are now in, because And here's the big picture, gang. We now live in a world, in a culture, where the appropriate responses, where acceptable responses are narrowing for one side, while at the same time they are ever more expanding on the other side. So again, in the good old days, when people could actually communicate intelligently with each other, you didn't have to solve problems by running into the streets and beating each other over the head, brandishing knives, or shooting people. No, this is why people had local town hall meetings. You debated, you discussed, you argued. Yeah, there might have been a lot of heat with it, but it wouldn't come to blows necessarily. And if it did, it was, private scuffles and fights, and those were broken up. People believed that you could win the day through argument, through persuasion, through the ballot box. Well, now, unfortunately, we are told that all these means that those are not good enough. If you actually expect people to argue with you logically, to reason with you, to reason together, as Socrates said, well, that's just another sign of your white privilege, because believing in objective truth, believing in the power of the spoken and the written word, all those things, those are now signs of white supremacy, as the critical racial theorists have now told us. So you can't do that. You cannot depend on the ballot box, because apparently people are still being oppressed and they can't vote because you can't vote whenever you want. In some places you still have to show voter ID, even though, almost every single country, India has voter ID. Chad and Nigeria and Africa have voter ID laws. Everywhere, voter ID laws are the norm, except in the United States, where it is uncontestably a sign of racial oppression. So you can't depend on the ballot box either. What we saw last year is the normalization of mobocracy, of street violence, massive street violence. Not just a couple of guys who were on opposing sides of an issue kind of get into a brawl, because that's normal. That's been going on since civilization began. But we're talking about massive. We're really talking about anarchy. We are talking about massive mobs burning, looting, and in many cases, and in some cases, killing people. Remember David Dorn. Remember, these people actually seceded from the Union. Remember the former great state of Chad, later on Chaz, which was a couple of municipal blocks of Seattle. Protesters actually took over the streets and had signs facing out into the rest of Seattle, so that people outside of Chaz looking in would see the sign that says leaving the United States, meaning that if you went into Chazistan, as it was called by the great Mark Stein, you were leaving the United States. These people last year were full on seceding from the Union. But we're supposed to tear, the same reason why we're supposed to tear down every single memorial and remembrance of the Confederacy, because they were absolute traitors who you were trying to secede from the Union. And within these autonomous zones, you had killings. You had people dying because the police either were told not to go in, or they decided, nope, we're not going to go in, which is a dereliction of their oath of office, and they should be held accountable for that, because then they are partially responsible for those people dying. But that has all been normalized on one end. On one side, you can burn, you can loot, you can pillage, you can trespass, you can even secede, and it's perfectly fine. The mayor of Seattle, whose name I have forgotten, but mercifully so, said it was just a summer of love. Just a summer of love. And remember, this was happening all over the place, gang. Not just Minneapolis and Seattle, but Portland and St. Louis and New York and Philadelphia and Atlanta and Los Angeles and San Francisco. Is happening everywhere. Meanwhile, on the same side, You can't do any of that. Let me cast your minds back to January 6th of 2020. A group of people started enthusiastically protesting, we might say. We couldn't even call it rioting at the Capitol. And all of a sudden, they're terrorists. They're terrorists, even though not one Capitol Hill security guard, police officer, quote unquote, was violently killed by any of these protesters. The only person who was violently killed was one of the protesters herself, Ashley Babbitt. The officer who actually shot and killed her, his identity remains nameless, because the Capitol Police basically told Ashley Babbitt's family, no, we're not going to give out that information. We don't do that. So, find closure somewhere else. So, you can protest violently, you can riot, and you can loot, and it's just in the workings of justice on one side. On the other side, if you try to pull that off, you're a white terrorist. You have chosen your whiteness over democracy, as Nancy Pelosi said. And meanwhile, the common ground over here, argument, debate, persuasion, voting, that has been cast aside. So what this means is that the permissible actions are expanding on this side and contracting on this side. And when you have a situation like that, you don't have a civilization anymore. You definitely don't have a just one anymore. You don't have an ordered one. What you have is a mobocracy that is being reined in by an elite cast of ideologues. That's what you have. And there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. You can't vote it out of power. You can't vote it out of office. And if you try simply to use their own medicine against them, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, they're going to throw the entire weight of the law against you. They're going to throw the book at you. And they're going to get you with whatever they can make stick, like what happened with the McCloskeys here. So what's the situation? So what's the solution, gang? You got to tear down the system. You've got to tear down the system, and you have to say that I will not serve. You just have to say it. You have to divorce yourself completely from this mess. Get it out of your head that this is a just society, that, we have to obey the law, because when the law is flagrantly bastardized in this form, you're under no obligation to obey unjust laws. And this is really a question that we are going to have to face, I think, in the near future. We're going to have to decide exactly, do we tolerate this? Do we just keep our heads down and put up with this situation, this new balance of power? Or do we actually do something? And if that is the case, we ask ourselves what Sean Connery asked Kevin Costner in The Untouchables. How far are you willing to go to get Capone? That's the real question. Costner then replies, as far as the law will allow me to go. To which Connery says famously, and then how far are you willing to go to get Capone? How far are we willing to get Capone? That is story number one.